At the farthest edge of the Dominican Republic's coastline, the wind moves differently around Villa La Caracola. It does not blow. It circles. It whispers. It lingers. The salt of the Caribbean hangs thick in the air, coating the gates, the palms, the bronze handles that have not been touched in years. From afar, the mansion appears serene, its white walls glowing against the turquoise sea. Up close, it is oppressive. Too perfect, too silent, too closed. A fortress of wealth born from the ruins of a starving nation. Inside, marble floors mirror the ceiling lamps, frozen in their own reflection. Every corridor smells faintly of perfume and moisture, the scent of a place sealed too long. In the grand hall, the sound of the ocean is distant, muffled by layers of glass and concrete. Curtains still hang heavy over panoramic windows, as though shielding the house from the gaze of the world outside. Each room tells of an attempt to recreate paradise, imported Italian furniture, tropical gardens designed by European landscapers, a private dock carved into the reef. But nothing grows naturally here. Even the flowers seem rehearsed. For years, this mansion was more than a hideaway. It was the mirror of power displaced. Officially, it belonged to a private company registered through shell accounts in Panama. Unofficially, it was where members of the inner circle of Nicolas Maduro's family spent seasons away from Caracas. A place to breathe, to plan, to forget. Here, decisions were whispered under the hum of air conditioning. Alliances were cemented between sips of imported whiskey. The walls absorbed the murmur of fear and the laughter of denial. Late at night, guards patrolled the cliff's edge, their shadows stretching long across the polished stone. They said the president would arrive by night, unseen, transported under false names. Whether it was him or merely his echo, no one could say. What remained constant was the feeling that the sea below, black and endless, held the same unease as those inside. The mansion was beautiful, yes, but beauty in exile often rots faster than ugliness. When the U.S. authorities finally traced the property's ownership and froze its accounts, Villa La Caracola became a relic overnight, a monument to a regime that had turned its hunger into architecture. Journalists called it the Caribbean throne of silence. Locals, more poetically, called it the house that drowned in its own reflection. And yet, the story of this mansion does not end at its gates. Because far away, across the sea, another house was breathing heavier by the day, a house not of marble, but of fear. Its name, Casa de los Pinos. It was there that the echoes of La Caracola would return, transformed into the whispers of betrayal and confinement. Power had built its refuge. Now it was building its tomb. Deep within Caracas, beyond the checkpoints and layers of armed silence, rises the grey anatomy of Fort Tiuna, a military city within a city. In its heart stands Casa de los Pinos, a mansion that was never meant to be seen, only to be obeyed. Unlike Villa La Caracola, there is no horizon here, no sound of the sea. Only the low hum of electricity, the constant rain of the tropics against reinforced glass, and the echo of boots along corridors that lead nowhere. It is a house that breathes through machines, a structure whose life depends entirely on the fear it shelters. From the outside, Casa de los Pinos seems like an administrative building, wrapped in concrete, surrounded by pines that block the skyline. But inside, it is another world, a place where the walls are double-layered and the windows bulletproof, where each door opens only with multiple authorizations, and where light itself seems filtered through anxiety. The rooms are vast but empty. Paintings have been removed, carpets rolled up. What remains is the geometry of paranoia. Long halls, mirrored elevators, sealed staircases, surveillance rooms that glow faintly red even when no one is there. Every sound in this house carries weight. The click of a lock, the murmur of a guard, the static of an intercom. all merge into a language of tension. Here, the concept of day and night dissolves. Time bends to the rhythm of the cameras and the orders that flow through them. The smell of disinfectant replaces that of luxury. In the private quarters, the air is cold, conditioned, metallic. No trace of the sea breeze from La Caracola remains. Only the hum of recycled air, the scent of fear trapped inside the vents. Those who entered this mansion during the final months of the regime spoke later, always off record, of a place that seemed to shrink as the city outside erupted. Maduro's family members, once divided between Caracas and their Caribbean retreat, gathered here like passengers of a sinking ship. The corridors became narrower, the voices lower. The president's footsteps echoed through the residence late into the night, followed by advisors whose faces had forgotten how to smile. He trusted no one. The rooms closest to his office were emptied, converted into buffer zones. Every visitor passed through scanners, every servant interrogated for loyalty. Even silence became a weapon. And still, in the deepest part of the house, beneath the main hall, behind an unmarked steel door, there was a room untouched by time. The sala de control. Rows of monitors flickered endlessly, projecting the images of streets, protests, and foreign news channels muted on repeat. It was said that he watched them all, alone, the glow of the screens painting his face in shifting blues and whites. For him, the world had become a series of moving shadows, enemies everywhere, loyalty nowhere. Casa de los Pinos was no longer a mansion. It was a mirror reflecting the mind of its master, fortified, sleepless, collapsing from within. As the crisis deepened, the contrast between his two homes, La Caracola's silence and Los Pinos' confinement, became unbearable. The ocean and the mountain, the dream and the bunker, two extremes of the same isolation. The first was beauty without peace. The second, power without rest. Both were prisons, but only one had a door that could still open. When the helicopters began to circle Fort Tiuna in the grey dawn of 2026, the house did not tremble. It simply exhaled. The walls, long saturated with whispers, seemed to absorb the final commands echoing through the halls. For the first time in years, the cameras in the sala de control showed a new image, the outside world closing in. That morning, the history of Casa de los Pinos became inseparable from the fall of its last inhabitant. And yet, even as the lights flickered out, one question remained suspended in the thick air of the mansion. Where does power go when it runs out of places to hide? At first light, Caracas was a ghost of itself. The city below Fort Tiuna lay wrapped in mist, as if the air were holding its breath. The streets were empty, except for the faint rumble of armored vehicles converging on the southern perimeter. Within Casa de los Pinos, the atmosphere was thick, almost tangible, a silence so absolute it felt sculpted. For years the mansion had been an instrument of control, but now it stood as a witness to its own unraveling. The marble floors that once reflected the calm authority of power now carried only the restless echo of hurried footsteps. Somewhere deep inside, a generator trembled, its sound breaking the stillness like a distant heartbeat. Inside the residence, light filters through narrow windows, cutting the darkness into geometric fragments. Dust drifts in the air, catching the glow of emergency lamps. The scent is unmistakable. Cold metal, oil, and the faint trace of smoke seeping through the ventilation ducts. Soldiers move through the halls in pairs, their boots synchronized, their radios whispering orders that sound more like confessions than commands. Every corridor they cross feels smaller, every door heavier. The house seems to resist being opened, as if it had grown accustomed to secrecy and now feared exposure. In one of the upper rooms, the curtains are drawn halfway, revealing the edge of the mountains. The wind outside hums against the reinforced glass. A photograph, long forgotten, hangs crooked on the wall, a portrait of the house itself taken years earlier, when the pines outside were green and full. Now they stand withered, their needles falling onto the courtyard like ash. Time, in this place, does not pass. It accumulates. There are stories, whispered later by those who entered the mansion after the siege, of strange details. Tables still set for meals that were never eaten, mirrors covered with black cloth, a piano in the main hall with a single key pressed down by dust. Some said the sound of a television still echoed faintly from the control room long after the power was cut. Others claimed that one of the servants had remained behind, unwilling to abandon the house she had cared for since it was first built, wandering its corridors in disbelief as soldiers filled every doorway. None of these details were ever officially confirmed, but all of them felt true, because in Casa de los Pinos, truth and illusion had long shared the same air. Outside, the helicopters hovered lower now. The pines shuddered in their downwash, scattering leaves across the roof. Within minutes, the final breach would begin, the culmination of years of fear and preparation. Yet inside the mansion there was no chaos, only stillness. Every sound seemed swallowed by the walls. Even the hum of the generator faded, replaced by a low, pulsing vibration that no one could trace. The house had entered a kind of suspension, caught between surrender and memory. In that silence, it was possible to sense the weight of everything that had happened here, the whispered meetings, the betrayals, the decisions made in desperation. The air carried the residue of all of it, invisible but heavy. For those who entered that morning, Casa de los Pinos was not merely a site of capture. It was a mausoleum of power, a place where authority had finally turned to dust. The soldiers who walked its corridors later said the mansion felt alive, as if the walls were still listening, still guarding secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. By midday, when the last helicopter lifted from the compound and the pines stood motionless again, Casa de los Pinos fell into silence for good. The electricity was cut, the gates sealed, the rooms left untouched. In the dim light, the mansion looked peaceful, almost serene. But that peace was only the surface. Beneath it lingered the echo of decades, the murmur of a nation's collapse condensed into one building. Far away, across the sea, Villa La Caracola remained empty too, its windows reflecting a sun it no longer belonged to. 2 houses, 2 mirrors, each reflecting the same truth, that power, when stripped bare, leaves behind only silence and architecture. And somewhere, deep within that silence, history waited, patient, unblinking, listening. Weeks after the fall, Casa de los Pinos remained sealed, its entrances guarded by silence rather than soldiers. The air of Caracas moved differently around Fort Tiuna. Even the birds avoided the pines that bordered the compound, as if nature itself understood that something irreversible had happened there. Inside, the house slept. Dust began to settle across the marble, softening the sharp edges of the architecture. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the blinds, cutting narrow beams through the gloom, revealing the delicate choreography of dust particles, slow, aimless, suspended. The once living mansion had become a chamber of echoes. Investigators arrived days later, their footsteps the first to break the stillness. They entered cautiously, their voices lowered, as if crossing a threshold into sacred ground. The air was heavy, unmoving. It smelled of cold metal and something faintly sweet, the lingering perfume of past occupancy. On the grand staircase, boot marks overlapped in multiple directions, a chaotic map of the final hours. Yet no sign of struggle remained. Everything had been evacuated with surgical precision, as though the house itself had orchestrated its own erasure. The living room told a different story, furniture draped in white sheets. A half-open drawer revealing neatly folded papers, none official, all personal, photographs of smiling faces, birthday scenes, a child's drawing taped to the underside of a desk. In one corner, A television still glowed faintly blue, its screen cracked, repeating a frozen image of static. A forgotten cup of coffee sat beside it, its surface hardened into a mirror. Every object in that room felt like an unfinished sentence. The team catalogued everything. They took samples from the walls, fingerprints from doorknobs, recordings of the ambient noise. But what they couldn't measure, what none of their instruments could detect, was the sensation that the house was aware of their presence. The temperature shifted subtly as they moved from room to room. A soft vibration could be felt underfoot, like the hum of a distant generator, though the power had long been cut. Someone mentioned the word memory. No one replied. In the lower levels, behind reinforced doors, they found what they later called the nerve of the mansion. A vast room of monitors, switches and communication consoles. The control center. Its walls were lined with screens, most dark, some still flickering with frozen frames from surveillance cameras across Caracas. Faces, streets, gates, the world as it had been observed from within. On one table, a small notebook lay open, filled with half-legible notes in hurried handwriting. Dates, initials, arrows pointing to nowhere. Next to it, a single burned candle had melted onto the steel surface, its wax hardened like a fossil. What struck them most was not what they found, but what was missing. No official documents, no weapons, no traces of resistance, only absence, carefully arranged. It was as if the mansion had anticipated its own investigation, had prepared itself to be read as a mystery rather than a confession. Every wall concealed what it refused to reveal. Every silence spoke louder than sound. Outside, as night descended again over Fortuna, the pines swayed under a heavy wind. From a distance, the house appeared unchanged, dignified, immutable. But those who had walked its halls carried away an impression that would never fade. Casa de los Pinos was not empty. It had simply transitioned from a place of command to a monument of consequence. Its silence was no longer political, it was historical. Meanwhile, across the Caribbean, Villa La Caracola began to show its own wounds. Without caretakers, humidity consumed its perfection. The ocean breeze, once fragrant and inviting, now carried salt that corroded metal and marble alike. Birds nested in its eaves. Curtains disintegrated under relentless sun. The same fate that haunted the bunker in Caracas had crossed the sea. Decay following silence like a shadow. Two houses. Two ghosts of the same regime. One buried in concrete and pines, the other dissolving into the sea. And between them stretched the invisible thread of a vanished authority. The echo of voices that once filled every corridor, and now existed only as reverberations in empty rooms. History had taken back its space. The mansions no longer belonged to power, they belonged to memory. Months passed, and the two mansions, one surrounded by the whispering pines of Caracas, the other by the restless Caribbean, began to transform. Nature, indifferent and methodical, reclaimed what power had tried to preserve. In Villa La Caracola, the ocean spoke louder now. Waves struck the cliffs with an almost rhythmic insistence, eroding the foundation grain by grain. Sea salt crept into the marble, spreading pale veins through the stone like frozen lightning. The scent of decay mingled with that of the tide, sweet, metallic, inescapable. Inside, silence ruled. Furniture wrapped in white sheets took on the shape of ghosts. Chandeliers hung crooked. Walls once painted ivory now shimmered with damp stains that resembled shadows of movement. Visitors rarely came. Occasionally, fishermen anchored near the cove spoke of flickering lights in the upper floors, reflections that moved though no electricity remained. The authorities had sealed the property, but the locals still felt its presence, the house that watched the sea. From a distance it seemed asleep, up close, alive. They said the sound of the wind through the broken windows carried the faint rhythm of conversation, as if the walls themselves were remembering. Meanwhile, in Caracas, Casa de los Pinos endured its own metamorphosis. The concrete shell, once impregnable, began to crack. Moisture crept along its foundation, staining the walls in long, dark streaks. The air around Fort Tiuna hung heavy with the scent of rain and rust. The military had abandoned the inner compound. Only guards at the outer gate remained, posted without purpose, their duty reduced to silence. By night, the mansion stood against the skyline like a black monolith, unlit, unvisited, watching. Inside, the air was cooler than outside, dense with the odor of stone and memory. The investigators' footprints had faded beneath new dust, but their equipment marks remained. White chalk lines, tape residue, a single flashlight left behind on a ledge. The mansion had not been emptied of its essence. It was as though it had chosen to hold on to the echoes, each whisper and breath fossilized in its structure. The sound of dripping water from a cracked pipe echoed through the lower hallways like a slow metronome. For the first time since its construction, Casa de los Pinos belonged to no one, yet it still ruled the imagination of a nation. Journalists, unable to enter, speculated about what had been hidden in its depths. Conspiracy blended with history, truth blurred with myth. They wrote that tunnels beneath the mansion connected to hidden archives. Others claimed secret vaults lined with gold or documents that could rewrite the story of a government. But those who had truly stepped inside knew the only treasure left there was silence. Far across the sea, Villa La Caracola faced its own ghosts. The once luxurious pool had become a mirror of rainwater, its surface broken by falling leaves. The private dock, where boats once brought guests under starlight, now lay half-collapsed into the surf. And yet, something in the air remained, an echo of laughter, the faint perfume of lost summers. The walls, covered with mold and salt, seemed to hum when the wind passed. In their decay, the two mansions began to resemble one another, different climates, same destiny. It was as if history itself had decided that beauty and power would share a single fate, silence. Every empire leaves behind ruins. Every ruler leaves behind a house. Some crumble quickly, others remain standing as reminders of what can never return. Both La Caracola and Los Pinos stood now as twin monuments to the same truth, that no architecture, no matter how fortified or divine, can outlast the fear that built it. And still, somewhere between Caracas and the Dominican coast, a wind carries both their names, whispering them into history, as though the earth itself insists on remembering. By the time the first anniversary of the fall arrived, both mansions had become legends. In Venezuela, people spoke of Casa de los Pinos as if it were a living memory, a monument that refused to die. Journalists who attempted to approach the compound were met by soldiers who said nothing, whose silence felt more eloquent than any denial. The road leading to the southern gate of Fort Tiuna had grown uneven, weeds breaking through the asphalt. Streetlights flickered but never stayed on. At night, the air smelled of rain-soaked concrete and pine sap, a strange combination that clung to the skin and lingered in the mind. Inside, humidity reigned. The ceiling leaked in thin, slow streams that traced paths along the walls. The sound of dripping water had become the heartbeat of the house, constant, indifferent. In the control room, cables lay like veins across the floor, their ends rusted, their purpose lost. Yet even without power, some screens glowed faintly when lightning struck outside, as if feeding on memory rather than electricity. Each flash revealed fragments of the room, overturned chairs, scattered files, a faded flag curled on the ground. An investigator returned that year, accompanied by a film crew granted limited access. They recorded the silence, the walls, the texture of abandonment. When the footage was later released, something remarkable happened. Viewers noticed reflections, shapes in the glass that had not been seen during filming. A figure, blurred, standing near the staircase. Another, faint, moving behind a curtain. It was dismissed as optical illusion, light interference. But the rumor spread fast. Casa de los Pinos was not empty. The mansion, they said, was replaying its own memories. Across the sea, in the Dominican Republic, Villa La Caracola had drawn a different kind of attention. Property developers eyed the land, calculating profit over history. Yet every attempt to acquire it met resistance. Bureaucratic delays, lost papers, legal disputes that seemed to emerge from nowhere. As if the house itself refused to be sold. The ocean continued its slow reclamation, waves gnawing at the cliff beneath the terrace. The scent of salt was overpowering now. Coral dust gathered on the marble steps. When the moon rose, its reflection broke on the cracked glass of the upper floors like fractured silver. A journalist who visited the perimeter described the atmosphere as eerily peaceful but listening. He noted how sound carried differently near the property, how footsteps on gravel echoed longer than they should, how wind through the palms seemed to whisper in human cadence. The locals avoided it entirely. Fishermen steered their boats wide of the cove, claiming the tides there moved unpredictably, as if drawn toward the mansion. At night, from miles away, a faint light could sometimes be seen in the main hall, one lamp glowing and fading, like breath. In both places, time had folded. The bunker and the villa, though separated by an ocean, had become mirrors again. Two frozen hearts beating to the same invisible rhythm. Caracas and the Caribbean, both haunted by architecture that once embodied dominance, now defined by silence. Historians debated their meaning. Some called them symbols of downfall, others relics of corruption. But there were those who saw them differently, not as ruins, but as witnesses. They argued that these houses had absorbed the human story more deeply than any archive could, that within their walls lingered not ghosts, but memories too dense to vanish. In that sense, Villa La Caracola and Casa de los Pinos had become repositories of an era, the architecture of consequence. And yet what united them most was not their past, but their waiting. Both stood on the edge of two different worlds, one at sea, one in the mountains, each listening for something that would never return. A knock that would not come, a voice that had fallen silent. When the wind rose over Caracas, it passed through the pine trees like the whisper of pages turning. And far away over the Dominican horizon, that same wind reached the cliffs, scattering salt into the empty halls of La Caracola. Two breaths of the same memory, traveling endlessly between the ruins of power. Years after the regime's fall, the world moved on, but the mansions remained. They stood as twin sentinels of memory, one buried beneath the pines of Caracas, the other dissolving into the salt and wind of the Caribbean. No official ever reclaimed them. No one dared to call them home again. The history they held had grown too heavy, their silence too dense to be broken. Casa de los Pinos was now guarded only by time. Rain pooled in its courtyards, feeding moss that crept up the columns like slow fire. The pines that once shaded its walls had grown wild, their roots cracking through the pavement, their branches scraping against the windows in the wind. Inside, what remained was the skeleton of vigilance, empty monitors, rusted locks, the faint scent of oil and cold marble. Yet sometimes, under the flicker of lightning, the glass walls still reflected a figure that was no longer there. The outline of power itself, fading, but not forgotten. Across the sea, Villa La Caracola had nearly vanished beneath nature's persistence. The ocean had claimed its outer terrace, vines crawled through shattered doors, its white facade had turned the color of driftwood, and yet, when the sun set, the mansion glowed faintly in the distance, as if the marble retained the memory of light. Waves crashed against its base with a steady rhythm, like the beating of a buried heart. The house seemed alive, listening, breathing, waiting for footsteps that would never return. Historians eventually stopped arguing over the truth of what had happened inside these walls. The details had scattered: classified reports, burned archives, erased files. But the architecture remained, more eloquent than testimony. Every scar on the concrete of Casa de los Pinos, every crack in the marble of La Caracola, told the same story in two dialects: the language of fear and the language of loss. Together, they formed the anatomy of a power that mistook endurance for immortality. In Caracas, children walking past Fort Tiuna pointed to the mansion's outline and whispered myths. They said the light still flickered when the rain came, that the pines bent in the direction of the house as if bowing. In the Dominican coast, fishermen steering by moonlight swore they heard faint music carried over the water, notes that began and vanished before reaching shore. Two places separated by distance but joined by atmosphere, both inhabited not by ghosts, but by memory itself. Decades later, a storm unlike any before struck the Caribbean. Waves rose high enough to breach the cliffs, tearing at the remnants of Villa La Caracola. When the sun returned, the house was gone, its walls scattered into the sea, its marble steps buried beneath coral and sand. Only fragments remained, washed ashore miles away: a broken lamp, a bronze key, a photograph sealed in salt. The ocean had erased its surface but preserved its essence. In Venezuela, Casa de los Pinos endured a different fate. As governments changed and wars faded into memory, the fortress was eventually opened to the public as a museum. Visitors entered through corridors where time felt suspended, their footsteps echoing through spaces that once decided the fate of millions. Guides spoke softly, aware that sound carried too easily in that place. In the control room, now restored, a single screen had been left intact, frozen on a frame showing the pines swaying in the wind. Outside, the trees whispered, their movement steady and unending. In the end, the two mansions became one narrative, the reflection of power's ascent and its inevitable collapse, one devoured by the sea, the other preserved in stone. Together, they formed the geography of memory, the architecture of consequence carved across two lands. The storm, the silence, the pine trees, the waves, all became part of the same breath. And so, when the night falls over Caracas and the ocean darkens beyond the Dominican horizon, the wind carries the same echo across both worlds: the sound of doors closing, the final whisper of power fading into history. Power dies, but the places it builds, those remain long enough to remember what the living choose to forget.